with me. Again, it's right at the night of the New Hampshire primary, but today was actually something that was planned. So because Mr. Gibbs had a doctor's appointment that he couldn't get rid of, or he couldn't escape. So the War Hamster has decided to grace us with his presence for today. And I just found out earlier, about an hour ago, that Mike is he is down for the count, sick as a dog. So there will not be a Tuesday with Mike and Ron and Mike tonight. So it's just going to be the War Hamster and I. And when we're done, we're done. So, how you doing, Sapphira? Good to see you.
Sure, it's good to be on. I remember had a lot of fun in the past years doing the show with you, me, and Doug when it was the Constitution. It was always I always had to run off immediately after, but there's a good time, so it's good to be back, and hopefully I see some familiar faces in your audience.
Well, you will. I told this morning I got up early and I played a 3-hour show by Mark Passio talking about like the kind of like the occult symbology and how it relates to 9/11. And I mentioned in there that that you were going to be on the show tonight, and I mentioned also last night as well. So, and a lot of people were very excited that you were going to be here. So
great. It's good. Yeah, it was great last week. Doing that impromptu. You read the comments in your on your channel. Saw a lot of old faces. It was kind of felt like a bit of a reunion. It's kind of cool. Including some of the original glitchers looked like.
Yeah. Yeah. I try to steer clear of conversation about that on my channel for obvious reasons. So, but anyway, that said, tonight we're this is going to just really be some dialogue between the War Hamster and myself regarding potential suspension of the Constitution, what that might look like, the legalities of it. There was I shared with Brady a video, and I probably should have shared it with the group. It was a video that I watched by a YouTube channel called Task and Purpose. And what he did was he was talking. He went and it was about a 20-minute video about how the cartels had taken over El Salvador, and El Salvador. It was El Salvador, wasn't it?
It was El Salvador.
Yeah, it was El Salvador. How El Salvador had essentially they elected this young guy to be their president, and he to deal with the just the overwhelming growth of the cartels and the gangs and whatnot, primarily MS-13. What he did was he suspended the Constitution, and they finally have been able to get a handle of the gang activity and put people away. There's I guess they built this ginormous supermax prison facility, and I mean they put so many troops on the streets and whatnot, and they've actually been rather successful at curtailing the violence from the gangs. However, the caveat with that is that what they did was, by suspending the Constitution, a lot of the rights that people had are now, I mean, the police can come in and search your house whenever they want. They don't need a warrant. It comes with all of the it's the old adage, or it's the old cliched was the quotation from Benjamin Franklin. Those who give away temporary security, or those who give away security for temporary freedom, will get neither security nor freedom.
Yeah, you got it backwards. Those who give up, those who give up their liberty for temporary security will end up with neither.
Thank you.
Neither liberty or yeah, and it's interesting. It's a great topic he brought up, and there's a lot of historical parallels, and it's gonna be a fun conversation. But really what you're looking at is, it was supposed to be 30 days of emergency powers, and
Mm-hmm.
now we're entering, we're pretty close to entering year 3.
Right.
And, when does a government, uh, whether it be well intentioned or not, you give it that kind of power, do they ever give it up? And
Mm-hmm.
it's a slippery slope. You may have cut down on your cartel drugs, but you also have given up a lot of individual liberties and rights and freedoms. And I'm obviously not an expert by any stretch on the El Salvadorian Constitution, but the vast majority of those constitutions in the Western Hemisphere were based on the U.S. Constitution in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine they've got some enshrined rights, about the search and seizure and everything like that. So
That's actually, I didn't look at that up. Mm.
the young president of El Salvador is a guy by the name of Bukele. Bukele, I think is pronounced, and he's interesting. He's a big Bitcoin fan, and they partially base their currency on Bitcoin. It can be used as a
Correct.
currency in their country.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they were probably the first country to do so, and so it's really worth watching how that turns out.
Well, I don't know if you went through the comments of that video. In fact, I'm going to share that video here with everybody. Let me find it here. Let me go to and find. Okay, here. So this is the. It's a 20-minute video. I'm going to put it in the live chat. You guys can watch it at your own discretion. And I'll also put it in the I'll put it as a comment in the comment section. It says how El Salvador destroyed their brutal gangs. Now, I don't know exactly what their constitution was. Now, I do know that even though a lot of the Central American constitutions were based on the United States Constitution, I also know that a lot of the Central American governments were most of their leaders were trained at the School of the Americas, and which is essentially a CIA school on how to become a brutal dictator and torture people and do all that kind of shit. So and I also I'm a firm believer that the cartels are really the street soldiers or the foot soldiers for the intelligence agencies. I do not believe that their outgrowth was spontaneous. I'm a firm believer that it was all of the how they grew was because they were the ones that were they were the ones that were selling the drugs and carrying the drugs and doing all that stuff. And they were, they're expendable. In fact, if you go back and you look at who was they talked about the group who killed Seth Rich, and that was MS-13. And then the two people who pulled the trigger on Seth Rich were themselves. They were immediately assassinated right after.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about MS-13 and how they came into being. I guess we probably owe your audience a brief history of that.
Mm-hmm.
When El Salvador was a really pretty wealthy country throughout most of the 20th century, but somewhere around 70% of the land was owned by about less than 1% of the people.
Mm-hmm.
They were exporting coffee. That was their economy, was coffee. And you start getting into the 1960s and 70s when you had the Cold War infiltrations, where both the Soviets and the Americans are sending tons of arms down there as they're battling for control in the jungle. This ties into Iran Contra.
Yep.
It ties into the CIA. We can touch on all these subjects if you want to, but the short history of it is, throughout the 1980s, when the drug trade really started to explode into America, El Salvador, had tons of arms there, and they weren't Sandinistas or Contras.
Sandinistas?
Yeah, they weren't Sandinistas though. Anyways, they're freedom fighters, which were basically
That was the Contras.
yeah.
The
The Soviet moles were better armed than the army, and
Mhm.
they had years of quite a bit of war and murder. And fast forward to 2010 or so, it had the highest murder rate in the world, and it's been terrible. And the reason why is it so important for us today? Not just the example of what happens when you uh, declare martial law, which is basically what they've done, but more importantly, if they're locking up all of their MS-13 types in El Salvador while the U.S. has a porous, open southern border, where do you think these people are going, and how many of them are here right now?
Mhm.
And it matters.
Mhm.
They've got very serious military training. These people, it's no joke. These MS-13 types, they can handle themselves. So they are very, very dangerous people.
Let me see here. I'm gonna find. I want to find this because there's some articles in here that talk about. Um, let's see, gangs and the military. Are gang members using military training? Army because gangs and the FBI announces gangs have infiltrated every branch. No. Did I send you that article where it talked about the gangs were being trained by? I know what it was. I'm using the wrong term. I should be using cartels. Cartels trained at U.S. military. U.S. Special Forces train Mexican drug cartels. And this is from. This is actually from Al Jazeera. Which let me share the screen. There you go. Let me make it a little bit bigger. So, U.S. trained cartel terrorizes Mexico. Founders of the Zetas drug gang learned special forces techniques at Fort Bragg before waging a campaign of carnage. So, this is what's happening. We are. Oh, hello, buddy. We are training these cartels at our military facilities and installations using military training, and they are going back down to Mexico and other places down in South America, and they are doing terror techniques against the population.
Yeah, Nick, we've got a long history of that. Do you want to touch on how that really started?
All right. Sure. Go ahead.
So there's some interesting bit of reading I've done a couple years ago, but there's a story of a guy by the name of Joseph Burkholder Smith, and he was a CIA station chief, like the number 2 person in Mexico City. And there was a gentleman by the name, we've talked about him before, but Theodore Shackley had come back to the States, and Shackley was
Well, just FYI, I just read an article last night talking about Shackley and all of the stuff. Really, last night, I read that article.
Well, Shackley's a personal favorite of mine of all the clandestine services. But by favorite, I mean he's the biggest scumbag on earth. The guy's just everywhere he went, chaos followed. And one of the things he did is basically he gets back to the Western Hemisphere, and Joseph Burkholder Smith gets a. Let me grab some notes here because I'll be able to tell the story best. Basically, gets a call from a guy by the name of Miguel Nazarjaro, and would have been the equivalent of the head of the CIA/FBI, Mexico's DFS. Mm-hmm. And it was this guy, this Mexican, bureau chief, that was kind of interviewing Burkholder Smith for his own job, to see if he's going to stay as station chief with a shakeup. And this is, I want to say it's 1973 or so. And what happens is Joseph Burkholder Smith ends up jumping into an airplane, and he has no idea where he's going. He lands in, he believes, Argentina. He thought it looked like basically Bavaria, with all the German designs of the buildings. Well, these are the people that came over from Germany, the fascists who got evacuated to Argentina after World War II, Operation Paperclip types.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, there's people out there, the swastika flags in the streets in Argentina. And well, it turned out that these guys offered, they wanted to find out what kind of man Burkholder Smith was, and they realized he wasn't the kind of person that they could use. And he ended up not keeping his job as Mexico City station chief or number 2. But what they were doing at the time is they were talking about, look, we're going to be shipping drugs into America. And this was the CIA working with former Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the very beginning of the cartels. The
well, that was Halliwell, and Halliwell was the one who put that forward. That was all a part of Operation Gladio.
Yeah, absolutely. Halliwell even goes back further than that, because he was operating in the Asian theater in early World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Halliwell's, the guy had a thing for airplanes, and he's certainly a figure that deserves quite a bit of scrutiny. But,
well, and let me, I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second. Why did, and it's going to ask a question, why did Paperclip exist? Why did we do that? Why was Paperclip created?
Well, you got to start with who created it, and that's Allen Dulles.
Okay, and why?
He was fighting a private. Dulles' background, you got to remember Sullivan and Cromwell.
Yes.
Sullivan and Cromwell had been around. They started their antics in the late 19th century. They were the law firm that basically enabled the annexation of Panama from Colombia to build a canal. Mm-hmm. They were the ones who had the boots on the ground before we invaded Hawaii, Guam, Philippines, etc. in the Spanish-American War in 1898. This is Sullivan and Cromwell. They're lawyers acting as intel agents, because the United States didn't have intelligence agencies during peacetime. We used lawyers for that function.
Right.
So the Dulles, you have to remember, the Dulles brothers were sitting at the table in Versailles in 1919 with the peace treaty, when they carved up Europe and the mm-hmm. Middle East and everything like that. This goes back a long ways, and there's a lot of connected people. And every single part of this, you got to mention the fact that it ties into Skull and Bones.
That's let me bring it back to what I was the point that I was going to, because I don't want to get down that rabbit hole too deep. Because the question that I wanted to pose was, why was Paperclip created? Paperclip was created because we wanted to prevent those individual Nazis from being taken in by the Soviets. So if we wouldn't have gotten them, the Soviets would have.
Well, that's certainly a consideration, but you have to look at the financial ties before it was apparent that the Nazis were going to lose, because it's these same people, the Prescott Bushes, the Brown brothers, Harriman connections that tie into the Dulles brothers and Sullivan and Cromwell, all these really elite families from the Eastern Seaboard. They were the ones who financed the Nazis in the first place in the 30s. They had connections going back 2 decades. So it wasn't just to keep these people. I call those Americans financiers the American fascists. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, did the fascists really lose the war, or did the German people lose the war? There's a big difference between the two. But I wanted to just the reason I brought up Skull and Bones, because I think it's interesting. Skull and Bones is obviously the symbol of pirates. They adopted that. Well, all the Skull and Bones money came from the original people in Skull and Bones came from opium money. This is a group of people that have always smuggled drugs. So it was very natural that their descendants, when the CIA was setting up their operations in South America, drug smuggling has always been part of the operation. It goes back centuries. Mm-hmm. So that's why I wanted to make that connection. But why do we do Paperclip? A lot of reasons, but
Well, and I don't disagree that we funded the fascists. That's actually, we funded the fascists, but we also funded the communists. We funded everybody. So
different group of people.
Similar.
Yeah. Well, I'd say London had probably more to do with funding the Bolsheviks, And my impression is that what happened with the Bolsheviks is they got off the leash.
Well, it was Trotsky who was in New York he was in New York, and he went all, I mean, he made it all the way through war-torn Germany in 1917 with 20 tons of gold from the United States.
You know the story about how he got stopped in Canada?
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson himself sent out a cable to get him released. So
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But my point is that I mean that wasn't that maybe it was London, but it was certainly London in conjunction with call it the Zionists of the day in New York.
Yeah, and we're talking about Warburg here. I'm sorry, we're talking about Jacob Schiff, right? Jacob Schiff was the one who really sponsored
I'd say maybe, but I'd also say that Baruch had a heavy hand in that as well.
I think Baruch's had his hand in a lot more things than we give him credit for. He keeps popping up over and over in books I read.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not someone who's talked about. It's Bernard Baruch for your audience. He might have been pretty much the biggest influence on Woodrow Wilson in many ways.
Well, and he was also the biggest influence on the World War II generals, because it was him who knew he was the one who essentially made it possible for George C. Marshall to be chief of staff, and it was him who had the relationship with Eisenhower, because when World War II started, Eisenhower was only lieutenant colonel.
Yeah,
and then I mean he went from a lieutenant colonel to essentially to a 4-star general and the commander in chief of the Allied forces in Europe.
Yeah, you're the one who brought that. You're the one who brought that to my attention. I looked it up. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So, it's funny. Baruch was a Wall Street guy. He wasn't a defense contractor or anything like that. So you'd think it would be the defense contractors that play kingmaker in the military, but no. Apparently, Wall Street still has their finger in that pie.
Yeah. The point is that there's just, the nefarious fingers run very deep into all of this crap, all over the world. And it's whether you want to say it's London or New York or a combination of both, whether it's, and whether you've got two different factions coming out of the United States, or whether one faction is primarily in the United States, where the other faction was from Europe, but had a second house in the United States. I would argue that would be the CFR. But the CFR Dulles was part of the CFR too. So it's like, and I don't know. I mean, these guys, there's so much overlay and overlapping with all these guys, and they may have had different philosophies and whatnot, but still, at the end of the day, they essentially are lobbying for the same thing.
Yeah, well, that's why I've always described it as it's a global Game of Thrones on steroids. And one of the things I've said is, God, what's the author's name? I've got a book right over here. I can grab it if I need to, but I always drop this guy's name. One of the people who was a lieutenant for Kissinger for about 25 years wrote a couple of books. And he describes who the real ruling class in the world is. And he describes it's about 6,000, give or take, oligarchical families from all over the world of every race, color, and creed. And they play this game where, it's pretty much, we're there above the law. And they play a game and the rest of us play by a different set of rules. And that's where you get things like the CFR. Now, for my money, I've always said that the Rockefellers sit at the head of the table. I've thought that has been the case for quite some time. And I'll accept there's some pretty good arguments against it. And we don't know who's right or wrong on that. But when you start talking about organizations like the CFR, who financed them, who built the United Nations, who gave that land, it's Rockefeller over and over again. Rockefellers gave you the World Economic Forum. They also gave you the Trilateral Commission. And this is all Rockefeller tied. So to me, that's who I think calls the shots. But that's kind of immaterial for your subject matter if you want to get back to El Salvador and why it matters to us.
Right. Well,
given all that background.
Yeah. It's and thank you for bringing it back. Basically, when we go back and you look at the American Civil War, when and I'm the reason that I'm drawing the parallel to the American Civil War is because it was during the American Civil War that Lincoln essentially suspended the Constitution, which is identical to what the president of El Salvador has done. And is it? Are we going to get into a situation in the fairly near future where we have a leader that is going to suspend our constitution because where there's going to be utter chaos in the world, and and my understanding is that with the if this insurrection act is signed, they can suspend the constitution. Is that true?
It's been a couple of years since I read the Insurrection Act. It's,
I don't know what that.
interesting you would bring that up because Lincoln wasn't the first person to try to suspend the Constitution. The Federalists tried it in 1878 with the Alien and Sedition Act, which is the Insurrection Act has a little bit of that language there. For those who don't know, in 1798, the Federalists were in power. John Adams is the president, and he had majorities in the House and the Senate. And they basically made it illegal to criticize the government. They were shutting down newspapers, and they were arresting people without suspended habeas corpus for speaking out against the government. This is less than 2 decades after this is the founding generation doing this. Now Jefferson goes out.
Let me pause you for a second, Juju. That was going to be the show at 5 p.m. 5 p.m. Pacific with Mike King. This was supposed to be the Constitution show, which is every week from 4 to 5. But Doug is out sick, or he had a doctor's appointment, so we had to postpone that. And Brady here has joining me for this hour. But the Mike has also called in sick, and we will not be doing that show tonight. So we will be postponing it for 1 week. Anyway, continue, Brady.
Thanks. Well, yeah, it's interesting that the way this is a founding generation, and what happened was Jefferson writes the Kentucky Resolution and the Virginia Resolutions spoke out against Alien and Sedition Acts, and the Americans rose up in the 1800 election, and the Federalists got voted out of power forever. The whole Federalist Party was gone, within 10 or 15 years. When it came, fast forward 60 years, when Lincoln does the same thing by suspending the Constitution. Well, the American people didn't get a chance to vote him out. And I can talk a bit about the 1860 election if you want, but go ahead and finish your point about it. That what actually happened, how all the rights that Lincoln took away.
Well, I mean, by suspending the Constitution, he suspended the Constitution. I mean, he jailed all. Remember when they kept talking about how Trump was running a crusade against the media? Well, Trump never put any media personality in prison. Okay, not one. But Lincoln actually, not only did he incarcerate people who were running newspapers and journalists, but he would go if there was a newspaper that was printing articles that were talking negatively about Lincoln and how he was prosecuting the war. He would send federal troops into the newspaper, shut the newspaper down, incarcerate those men because he had suspended habeas corpus. He would jail those people and he would jail them indefinitely without trial, and they couldn't do anything about it. In fact, the Chief Justice of the land, Roger Butani, said you can't do this, and he actually was contemplating arresting the Chief Justice, and he didn't. But he couldn't do it. So.
Yeah, well, Lincoln most certainly did not have any kind of a huge majority. I mean, he won election in 1860 with 39.8% of the vote. There were 4 parties vying for that seat at the time, and 3 of the parties, including the corrupt Southern Democrats, the non-corrupt Northern Democrats, the remnants of the Know-Nothing Party Whigs, all wanted to try to keep the Union together.
Mm-hmm.
And when the war actually happened, after secession, then Lincoln starts arresting people that had never broken the law in the North because they were still opposing him politically. And he did not have that. He didn't really have that strong of an election victory in 1864. I mean, McClellan got 45% of the votes, and there's a lot of the Midwest states who been around, Illinois, Ohio, everything like that. They were breaking away from Lincoln and his Eastern Seaboard industrialist Northern Republicans. And I may as well throw this one out there because I think it's a great factoid and it's been in the news a lot. Right. Everyone keeps hearing that they can keep Trump off the ballot because there's precedent, because they kept Lincoln off the ballot in 1860 in 10 southern states. Well, that never happened. At the time, your political party would print the ballots in a certain color. The Republicans were pink that year. And you'd go out there. There was no secret vote. You'd go to the election place and you'd stand on a stump and say, here's my pink ballot for Republican. Well, what happened in the 1860s, the Republicans didn't even bother printing ballots in those states. But nobody in the South ever passed a rule and said you couldn't be on the ballot. Nobody ever proposed a rule. It's just the Republicans realized they're not going to get any votes, so they didn't want to waste the ink in the paper, which is interesting. So now we got Civil War, and he's suspending habeas corpus, and that's pretty terrible. I mean, all these rights that we're supposed to have that are God-given natural rights can be suspended in the case of an emergency. Well, would that ever happen again?
Well, why not?
Well, we just saw it. We just saw it under COVID. And that's one of the reasons I love this topic is, you remember last year, there was a New Mexico governor tried to enforce some pretty draconian gun laws.
Yes.
In New Mexico. What's interesting is she was actually in her rights, according to the New Mexico Constitution, the way she was doing that. But what I thought was fascinating is people were not questioning. It's these Emergency Powers Acts that gave her the rights to do things. She can just arbitrarily declare an emergency and have powers that the Constitution was never intended. We haven't pushed back hard enough about that in this country. We just saw draconian measurements almost as bad as Lincoln and almost as bad as the Federalists here in this country during the COVID lockdowns. And people aren't pushing back to get these laws repealed. And I think it's a problem. I think it's going to show up on us again.
I agree.
I mean, that's the fight we should be having. And we're not.
Well, people are so confused with all of the information that's out there right now. Nobody really knows what fight to fight.
I understand it. Yeah.
Nobody knows what fight to fight, because there's so many different things out there. And when I don't know, my thought process is, when the media is pushing a narrative, or there's one narrative being pushed, really even by the alternative media, what else is going on? What's going on that we're not seeing? What's happening that's not getting a lot of press? Because that is typically the one thing that you kind of just like, that's what you should really be looking for, is what are they not talking about?
Or what they're trying not to talk about. I think, to me, one of the biggest elephants in the room is the border crisis. And the Biden administration is trying to do everything in their power not to have the real conversation. They're trying to deflect, say, well, we need Congress to help us to pass these bills. No, you had executive orders to open the border. You can close them just as easily. We're not letting them get scotch. And now Mayorkas getting impeached is going to bring it front and center. I do have concerns, though, Ron, with these convoys that are leaving to go down to the border states right now. You familiar?
Oh, you mean the truckers?
No, just regular car convoys. Patriots just going down there to lend support in whatever way, shape, or form.
What are they going to do?
Lend emotional support. My concern is, of course, some kind of a false flag that gives
right. It'll be like J6 all over again.
It's exactly my concern. And here's why I bring this up. Is that park in Texas is about 2.5 miles of a border that's thousands of miles long, and you've got the video here, the 4-minute one of the guy who drove like 2 miles past that and showed all the openings in the border. Is this kabuki theater going on in Texas?
Here, you know what? Here, let me show this.
Yeah, cue it up. You got it. It's a 4-minute video.
No, it's not. I don't even need to do that. I'm just going to, I'll do this. Hold on. Let me find something here. Let me see here. Because I was down in El Paso. I was down in El Paso last week, and let's see. That's no.
I was born just a few miles from there.
Where are you?
Yeah, Del Rio. I was pretty darn young when I left, so I don't remember it. But yeah, that's where I'm actually from originally.
Interesting. I did not know that. Let me see here. I gotta find. It's not. These are not in. These are not in numerical order. I gotta find this one here. That you know what? Here, let me do this because this is. This will be. I can just go to it real quickly.
I'm about to show you what it.
Okay.
Is that the guy with the great beard?
No. Here, I'm going to share the screen real quick. And yeah.
Now we're in Mexico.
Yeah. And here we have Governor Abbott, 3 years late, acting like he's going to make a stand. And I'm telling you, something about this smells very fishy, Ron.
Mm-hmm.
And I have friends in those convoys that I've been in touch with. I just tell them, hey, keep your heads on a swivel.
Mm-hmm.
This could very easily be some kind of a setup. And, if Donald Trump's going to win the election in 2024, which all the polls seem to make it seem like, the powers that be are going to do everything in their power to stop it. There's too much money at stake. Trillions of dollars at stake. They're going to do everything in their power. Now, I don't think they can prevent an election absent martial law, but given what we've seen from the summer of love, the porous open border, we know the nature of the fighting age men coming across the border. It would not stun me to see a winter of love post-election and prior to inauguration. I'm just speculating here of what their plot might be, but they could have anything on the. They're looking for an excuse, martial law or the ability to suspend the Constitution, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's certainly on the menu right now, and we should be. I mean, it's something to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I don't know
I'm well, if you guys didn't see what I just played a second ago, in terms of that was me, and I was there with Nino, and we went across the border. Literally, I went. I mean, I that was the wall there, and you saw me standing. You saw me go from Mexico to America and back. I mean, I literally had one foot in the United States and one foot in Mexico. And I mean, there was a Border Patrol agent right there with us. He actually escorted us right to that place. And, I mean, I had a nice conversation with him, and he was actually pretty cool. But it was, I mean, the wall down there, it's porous as hell. It's absolutely porous as hell. There's no, the wall. In fact, here I'm going to let me show something here, because this will do another. This is just another more evidence of that. Let me share this. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, let me go to the satellite, and then I'm going to come down here to Mexico, or I'm going to come down here to.
What site are you using?
This is Google Maps. Okay, so this is Google Maps. This is the Mexico border, right? Here's the United States, and here's Mexico, and here's the wall. This right here is the wall. All right. Now, look right here. So Here is the wall. There's two walls, actually, two of them. And they come up here to right here. And now, well, actually, maybe I'm standing corrected. Maybe they have sealed this. Maybe they sealed this off, because at one point in time, this right here, you could go around. Right here, this was a gap in the wall, but it looks like they have actually looks like they've been working on wall construction. So this image may be older. So maybe I need to stand corrected.
Google Maps doesn't give you a timestamp on what you're looking at, do they?
No, not this particular one. No. But that's different than what it was before, because what it was before, there was an enormous gap. In fact, here, let me show it again. A long time ago, there was an enormous gap, really, from about okay. So you see here, let me come out just a hair more. You see the Interstate 8 right here, and then the road right here, 94. Okay, so for a long time, the wall stopped. There was a wall there, and then there was a wall here. But there was a good chunk of the wall that stopped from here to here. There was no wall. And that, I mean, this is mountainous territory, and people would cross in there, but there was no wall there. And then what they used was they used the terrain as as a barrier. But the terrain is I mean, yeah, it's rough terrain, but people can still cross there. So but anyway, I digress.
I managed to pull up the El Salvadorian Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty interesting. This couple of, Article 1 is, they recognize the human person as the origin and the end of the activity of the state, which is organized to attain justice, judicial security, and the common good. Title 2 is about fundamental rights. Every person has the right to life, physical and moral integrity, liberty, security, work, property, and possession, and to be protected in the conservation and defense of the same. All persons are equal before the law. But here's interesting. When I thought that was fun. Every person may freely express and disseminate his thoughts, provided they do not subvert the public order nor injure the moral, honor, or private lives of others. That's ambiguous. And you start talking about shutting down a constitution. Right now, you've got a seemingly benign dictator cleaning up something that was a serious problem, which is the El Salvadorian drug issue. But now the precedence has been set. If he has a successor who's not so benign, they're basically going to squash those rights pretty darn quickly.
Well, let me ask you a question, and I actually want to ask the audience of this as well, and I prefer that you guys answer in the live chat. Would you trust Donald Trump in a situation where if the Constitution was suspended for a period of time? Would you trust Donald Trump to ultimately give the power back and to use that power responsibly?
Yeah, responsibly is the right word there.
Would you trust him to do that? And I'm asking you guys, put yes or no in the live chat. Would you trust Donald Trump with that power?
It's going to be a little bit of a delay, so we'll wait to see where they come through there. Well, let's talk about it. Are they going to be able to? Can they phase the Constitution back in El Salvador? We were able to do that in 1798. We weren't able to do it in 1860 through 1864. The question is, we were sort of able to do it in 2020 with lockdowns, but here, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure where it goes.
I would actually, if it were me, I would trust Trump with that power. But I would, but I would, I would be heavily on guard. But I would trust Trump with that power.
So you've got a question in your chat. Bamlo says, "Why would the Constitution be suspended?" It would be for an to deal with an emergency that
hmm
could not be handled normally. And that's an issue. These Emergency Powers Acts, you can arbitrarily declare an emergency. We're going to see that with the climate emergency. We know this. The
hmm
climate is not an emergency. I don't know if you talk about the climate,
Well, it
the
depends
climate
on
crisis on your
depends
channel.
on who you're talking about. It depends on who you're talking to, and who's in control. It depends on
Okay,
who's in control.
so you live in California. Your governor is Gavin Newsom.
Yeah, I wouldn't trust him.
He declared an emergency and basically did things that the California Constitution does not allow, or the
Mhm.
U.S. Constitution,
Mhm.
and that was prevalent around the country.
Mhm.
And, so we do have an authoritarian bent to a certain, people of a certain political persuasion. I think that these Emergency Powers Acts need to be taken a look at like yesterday and stripped, because the abuse is just the abilities, the avenues of abuse are just way too easy.
So I think that if there was a temporary, like if it was say like 90 days, if it was a 90-day thing and it didn't come back after 90 days, at that point I'd be like, oh hell no, we want it back. I would get it back. But I would trust it if it was an extremely short period of time, with the potential maybe for a brief extension, but nothing beyond that. I just wouldn't. And I'd be ready to fight if it came down to it. I don't ever want to. I don't ever advocate for violence, but at a certain point in time, if your backs are against the wall, what are you going to do? And I think that's the point that a lot of the people and a lot of the patriots that weren't necessarily, followers of Q. I think that is, specifically like the Oath Keepers and whatnot. They were just, ardently anti Q operation because, the trust the plan guys, because they're like, hey, well, it's up to us, the patriots, that we should be the ones to go back and take control of the country, by force. Well, in my humble opinion, the weaponry that the deep state has to utilize against us is so far advanced than rifles and just rifles and foot soldiers. It's like, they've got microwave weapons that can fry people at a distance. It's and that's technology that nobody knows, or very few people know about. Sound weapons, and all kinds of stuff. I know, when I was in the Navy, we had, this is in 1991, we had these, they looked like they were basically like antennas, and they could point over a wide area, and they could launch, they could shoot microwaves out and basically fry people. It'd be like you being in a microwave oven, and you'd heat up. It was extraordinarily uncomfortable. And these were crowd control weapons that they had, and they had them in much higher power for the ship to to put off if we were in proximity of another vessel or whatnot. So, but they have those types of weapons for crowd control that they can bring in, and put on the top of a Humvee or a tractor trailer or something. We've got all kinds of crazy technology that people just don't even have
And that's, you really just teed me up for my response to your question, because that is true that the U.S. government has an amazing amount of capability. Therefore, it should never have the ability to step on any of our rights, even for 1 minute. I don't care who's in charge, whether it's Donald Trump or Jesus Christ. The Constitution never, there's no clause that says in case of emergency. When you come back to our most recent example, COVID, the government's job was to give us all of the information that they could and let us make informed decisions as free citizens. They never had the right to mandate, lock down, or any of that stuff. And they should never be allowed to do it again. That power, that emergency power to say, oh, things are dangerous right now. I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. That's
Mhm.
never turned out well. And why can't a free people with an intact constitution deal with an emergency any better than somebody, suspending the Constitution and saying, "Oh, we need martial law." I'm not going to give up my freedom for 1 second. My rights, my rights are given to me by God, and no emergency can take them away. If the government treats us as responsible citizens, says, "Look, we've got a problem. We all need to cooperate." Guess what? Responsible people are going to make the right decisions. You don't need the government to tell us what to do. That's my take on it. I'm totally erring on the side of the libertarian side of me is coming out here, but I don't think.
And I don't disagree with that, but okay. So now, and and I'm playing devil's advocate here, not because I'm trying to be argumentative with you, but what if you run into a situation where where you have to have some sort of an arrangement so that you can differentiate between the good and the bad.
Well, El Salvador was in a very precarious position. And it's a great example. That's why I'm glad you brought this up.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example. Could they have accomplished what they've done in any other way?
No, I don't think so.
I don't have the answer. I don't know. But we know they've got a constitution. It looks a lot like ours. It's based on the same principles. They call themselves a republic. There's obviously good people in El Salvador. The army's about 24,000 people. They seem to be, on the right side of this story, at least for now. They haven't abused their power too much. But was there another way for El Salvador to get themselves out of that? And maybe not, because
so I don't know if you read the comments in that video. Did you go read the comments? Okay, because I did, and there were a lot of people in the comments that were responding to that who were from El Salvador, and they uniformly said that that was the only way that they could have gotten the situation under control, because they have tried so many times in the past and failed, primarily because the government was essentially bought off by the gangs.
Well, yeah, they got more money. I mean, the cartels have more money than most major nations. I mean, they are running, what the fifth. I think the cartel network is now the 8th biggest economy in the world.
Something like that. Yeah.
That's probably understating it. So I get that, and that doesn't help that the United States and our various intel agencies keep arming, flooding the area with weapons.
Yeah. Well,
so I understand that is the definition of a state of emergency, and it's different than the United States. But could there ever be? Is there a situation that ever be so bleak in the states that you're willing to give up your individual liberties, or that we can't solve it and still preserve the Constitution? That's really the question.
And see, I don't know the answer to that question, but I would be remiss if I said I can foresee a brief period of time in the future where we may have to make that decision.
Yeah, and I would hope we err on the side of protecting individual liberties as much as possible. I mean, I do understand that there are some very potent enemy forces that may have to be dealt with using extraordinary measures. I would just suggest that we don't go to full martial law. We don't pull up an insurrection act. We don't implement the Alien and Sedition Acts. We don't go to civil war. I would hope we avoid all that. That would be, that's what we should be able to handle any emergency. And again, if the government actually trusted citizens and just gives us enough information to make informed, responsible decisions, we'll probably do the right thing, or most of us will.
Well, and let's just say this, and I do not believe in this country we have ever had a civil war, because the Civil War was not a civil war.
Could not agree more, Ron.
The Civil War was not a civil war. Because in a true civil war is two entities fighting for control of one thing, and the South was not trying to fight for control of Washington D.C. The South was fighting for self-determination. They wanted control of themselves, and the North was fighting to force them back under the control of D.C. So that was not a That was, and probably not the reason they were fighting for control of it is because the reason they were fighting for the South to get back under the fold of DC is because the North, the North was being essentially funded by the tariffs, and if the South would have been able to successfully break away and open up their ports to European traders, and they would have been able to come in and pay 10% tariffs instead of 40% tariffs, then the South would have been the South would have made a ton of money, and they would have been able to fund themselves.
Let me give you some fun statistics that backs up exactly what you said, because you're 100% correct. We're in agreement. You know, everyone talks about California seceded, it would be the 7th or 8th biggest economy in the world. Had the Confederacy been allowed to secede, they would have been the 4th biggest economy in the world.
Yeah.
Import tariffs, protective tariffs in the North are a tax on the South's exports, because you're taxing the people that are going to be the customers for the South. You're taking that money out of circulation. There's a direct correlation. That's the whole point of mercantilism. It's protective tariffs. B is internal improvements, which is basically using the U.S. tax dollars to fund companies that have good buddies in government to do these quote unquote internal improvements. At the time of the founders, it was, building canals. In Lincoln's time, it was railroads. And the amount of corruption that went through DC to get the railroads built, and the zigzag pattern is that politicians were getting bribed to get the railroad right-of-ways. The amount of money they steal, robber barons, and all. We created, those 40 years of single-party Republican rule post-Lincoln was the most corrupt era in American history, only to be rivaled by today. It's also the greatest wealth disparity. There's a reason it's called the Gilded Age, and it's a reason we call them robber barons. Mm-hmm. These are the people who founded your Republican Party.
Yeah, I would say for you guys in the chat who you don't know, the South gets a very bad rap because we have all been trained to think that the South was pro-slavery and they were fighting to protect slavery, and that the North was trying to free the slaves. That is a narrative that you have been sold hook, line, and sinker, and most people have bought it hook, line, and sinker, and that narrative is absolute, utter bullshit.
All right, Ron, I got a book here.
Now, I'm not saying that slavery didn't play a role, but the role that slavery played in the Civil War, or in what they call the Civil War, was maybe 5%, maybe, and that's probably being generous.
So let me address that, because once again, we're in agreement. That book I just held up, I just finished reading. It's called The Election of 1860. It was suggested to me by Brian McClanahan when I asked him for some source data. Michael F. Holt is the best 19th century historian, or among them. Wrote this whole book based on source documents called actual newspaper articles. And what he was talking about the 1860 election, he describes the fact that back then, it was a political party's platform that mattered, and that the candidate mattered less. There were 4 major parties in the 1860 election, and the major platform of Lincoln's Republican Party was not anti-slavery. It was basically they were fighting against, they were speaking out against the corrupt Southern Democrats, the slave power, and they were. The Southern Democrats, slave power politicians were corrupt as all hell. The other 3 parties all couldn't stand them. But the Republican platform didn't mention slavery at all. It did not. And
we are taught that the Republicans were the abolitionist party.
Yeah, in 1858, Lincoln has his speech in the senatorial debates, which basically anybody who thinks he's this great abolitionist needs to read that one single speech. You need to read his letter to, what is his name? Help me out, Ron. You know this letter. I got to pull this one up because it's just really famous one.
Well, if you guys really want an eye opener, the state of Lincoln was from the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois had banned. They made it illegal for Black people to live or to stay in Illinois for longer than 2 weeks at a time. So if you were in Illinois for longer than 2 weeks, you were either arrested and deported, or you were arrested and incarcerated. But just so you understand the code word of the day in the North, the reason that they say that they were anti-slavery is predominantly because they were against black people. They did not want black people living in the North. That's what they mean by anti-slavery. That the people in the North were very similar to, call them your liberals that live in wealthy areas, who do not want black people living in their neighborhood. Okay. They are all over the black causes and they'll happily fund the black causes. But if you got a black neighbor, they don't want them there, and they do not want them there at all. Whereas the South was very much kind of like it was like a suburbia mentality. And and I'm not going to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that there wasn't brutality on the plantations. There was, but that was much more the exception than the rule. What we are taught is, and where we get our mentality of how slavery was in the South, is from Hollywood, and that is not an accurate representation of what the slavery was like in the South. Now, I'm not saying the slavery was a good thing. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that what our understanding of what slavery was is grossly misunderstood.
Yeah, and the major political battle wasn't about ending slavery in existing states, because most people understood that the Constitution allowed the states to have their own determination there, absent an amendment. The big battle was about whether they'd allow the newer states that were coming on board over the next several decades should be allowed to be free states or slave states. And that was the major issue. And Kansas and Missouri was where that fight was taking place. And these corrupt Southern Democrats pulled all kinds of shenanigans out in the years leading up to 1860. And that's what the Republican Party was founded on, fighting against the corrupt Southern Democrats, not slavery. I found the letter, Ron.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham Lincoln, August 22nd, 1862, his letter to Horace Greeley.
Yeah.
I'll read like 3 sentences. Do you want me to?
Yeah, go. I know exactly what you're going to say. This is the one that was posted in the New York Tribune or something like that.
Yeah, Horace Greeley was it was just a constituent or what have you, but someone he knew. But here's the question on the table: was what are you going to do with slavery? And this is 2 years into the war. He says, "I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be, quote, the Union as it was." Well, that right there's a lie.
Mm-hmm.
If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could attain at the same time slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Lincoln was ambiguous about slavery at that point, and prior to that, he was absolutely. Some of his comments could be only described as racist and bigoted.
Mm-hmm.
So, he is not the great emancipier.
No.
And he did not save the Union. What he did is he basically changed the Union. It ceased being a voluntary union and became a national entity where all the states were subservient to one central federal government. That's what Lincoln accomplished. The man is a dictator.
Absolutely. And, so when the 13th Amendment is what freed the slaves, Lincoln didn't free the slaves. And in fact, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in territories that were, quote unquote, in rebellion against the United States.
Yeah, the Emancipation Proclamation freed exactly 0 states, including New Jersey was still a swing state. They they admitted West Virginia into the Union during the war as a slave state.
Yeah. And you had slavery in Maryland, you had slavery in Kentucky, you had slavery in Delaware, and you had slavery in and like you said, in New Jersey. And in fact, the New Jersey was the last state to have slaves.
1865. Had Lincoln proposed a plan where the last slave in America would have finally gotten their freedom in 1918, 60 years later. So that's what a great emancipator he was.
Mm-hmm.
That's in writing. I mean, this is historical. This is historically documented. That you can't make this stuff up. So, and this brings us back to the 13th Amendment, Ron.
Yeah.
Why did they? I'm sorry. The 14th Amendment. Why did they put that clause in there to say that the insurrection clause? Because they had to historically justify Lincoln's war of aggression.
Mm-hmm.
They had to do it. That's the sole reason it's there, and it's why. Same reason that we're dealing with insurrection now. They have to paint the picture that January 6th was an insurrection.
Yeah, and we're talking about. Are you talking about the 13th Amendment as it is now, or are you talking about?
I misstated the 13th. I meant the 14th Amendment. It's with the insurrection clause. I'm fine with the current 13th Amendment. I also like the original 13th Amendment.
Yes,
we both do.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, there was a 13th Amendment to the Constitution that was ratified in it was like, was it 1819, 1818, 1819, something like that.
Yeah, it would have been 1811. It was prior to the war of 1812 originally.
But I think it was Virginia didn't ratify it until 1819 or something like that.
Yeah, Doug and I argue about this. I agree with you. He says it was 1819, or he said it was done beforehand. I agree with you, but I don't know who's correct.
Yeah, it's very difficult to find because most of those records were destroyed, and I believe that Lincoln had a hand in destroying those documents because that's what he did during in his prosecution of the war of Northern Aggression.
Well, he was a lawyer.
Yeah, and I mean it was very easy for him to send troops all over with the Constitution suspended. He could go all over the North and send federal troops into all of the courthouses, and he had free hand to do it all over the South. So, and they basically they destroyed everything they could.
And that the original 13th Amendment was basically about titles of nobility and lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
The most important thing is the word honors. You really couldn't have immunity just for being a judge or a congressman or anything like that. It was basically to keep the whole legal system in check. And that whole amendment just kind of got memory hole, disappeared somewhere around the Civil War. There's no evidence that your theory about Lincoln destroying the 13th Amendment is correct, but it sure seems to make a lot of sense that is possible.
Yeah. There's because to me that is the only time that it could have been memory hold.
Yeah, well, we know the time is right. We've got the last documents of it being in effect. I think, or 1857 or 8,
right?
And then all of a sudden, it just disappears from every history book.
Well, and you look at you look at prior to the Civil War. It was the United States, from a grammatical standpoint. The United States was the United States are. Okay, after the war between the states, it was the United States is. So it went from, instead of it being R as in ARE, all the United States are, as in like we all are something. So we are all in a group, but we are coming together as one. Whereas the United States is, in terms of it being a singular entity.
Yeah, and that's how we got down that's how we made our way down the path of tyranny. It went from being the government being an agent of us as a principal to the other way around. Now the government's the principal and we are their agents, and that's got to be reversed. People talk about nationalism being a good thing where they describe the MAGA movement. No, nationalism is not a good thing. That's what Lincoln gave us. We want to go back to federalism, small f federalism, where each state is sovereign and we can handle things locally. And the federal government needs to get back in its lane and only handle things like international affairs and settling interstate disputes. And that's it. Shrink the federal government back down to its intended size.
Nationalism is a good thing from the standpoint where everybody likes their country, but we need to understand that the country is a good thing, but we also need to be, we need to recognize that the states have a much bigger role here. People do not understand that the United States is, while it is one country, it really is a collection of 50 individual countries. And that's what people fail to understand.
That's what made it unique. And it's a union of sovereign states. And well, we can go down this rabbit hole some other time because we're well past the hour. Do you want to wrap us up?
No, yeah, well, we're good. We kind of bounced around quite a bit, but I mean, at the end of the day, talking about the Constitution and the whether or not it's going to be suspended in the future, I don't know, but I'm of the opinion that we may potentially see a situation where they do suspend the Constitution, even if it's for a short period of time. I do believe that is something that may indeed be coming, and if it is, I would just warn everybody to let's see who's in control if that happens.
Yeah, that matters a lot. It's when you say they may do it, who is they, and what are the reasons for it? And again, my position's not going to change. There's probably no emergency that requires you to take away my God-given natural rights. So let's hope you're wrong, but you're right. It certainly is in play, and
I think it definitely is in play, and I think to think it wouldn't be in play is naive, in my opinion. And a lot of people who think that it can't happen here because it hasn't happened here, that's a very dangerous way to think.
Because we've shown 3 examples now where it has happened in this country. We've seen the Constitution suspended 3 times. 1798, 1860, and again in 2020.
I will say, Yarn, I do not believe that we are going to balkanize. I disagree that we're going to balkanize. I mean, that's a possibility, but I just don't think that the United States is going to balkanize.
We're not split regionally in terms of north-south like we were in 1860. Now it's more of a rural-suburban, or urban versus rural type of split more than anything else. So, it's very difficult to take a country that's as complex as the United States and have an amicable splitting. Who gets the nukes? Who gets the debt?
Right.
What are you going to do with airspace? Are we going to be friendly trading partner? I mean, there's so many complexities to splitting it up.
And let me just say this, that I don't know if you guys understand what I mean by balkanization, but that's basically what Yarn said. Yarn is in the chat, and she said that I think we are going to be broken up. And I was saying that is basically that's balkanization. And balkanization comes from the former Yugoslavia, which is in the Balkans, and the former Yugoslavia basically became 7 different countries, 6 or 7 different countries with Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Croatia.
That's stuff still going on to this day.
Yeah, but my point is that when all that area broke up, that was called balkanization, and that is I do not see the United States balkanizing. I just do not see us breaking up into all these little bitty countries. In fact, if we do balkanize, it is going to be balkanization to where it was originally supposed to be, where we had 50 unique individual countries under the banner of one flag.
Which is exactly what we want.
Exactly.
So in that particular case, we probably ought to split back up and take away all the power, or most of the powers of the federal government, giving back to the government. Exactly. Well, that's a happy note to end this on.
I agree. All right, guys. Well, hey, I appreciate everybody tuning in. Apologize for the bait and switch. It wasn't my intention. Mr. Gibbs had to postpone on me yesterday. Sent me a message, and And then I got a message earlier today that Mike is not well and he's sick as a dog. So he said he could not do a show tonight. So it is the War Hamster and myself, and I very well may come back. I'm probably not. I have some things I need to get done, so I'm probably going to take the rest of the night off. But I will be back tomorrow to read more of the CIA and the Bush family. So I will see you guys tomorrow afternoon. So everybody have a great night. Thank you, War Hamster, for joining me today.
Does everybody know where to find me?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Tell them.
Yeah, check out my channel at war_hamster and on Rumble. I've been putting out a lot more content over the last couple of months. I'm now off the bench. I can no longer be restricted, and I'm doing a lot more content. I got a couple of really fun topics coming up, and I might just be inviting Ron Partain onto my channel as a guest for one topic in particular. So come check it out. I've got a lot of good stuff coming.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking the time and coming on today and pinch hitting for Mr. Gibbs. Appreciate it. And we will see you guys mañana. Have a good night, everybody.
Cheers.